And what I think is really interesting is that in and of itself changes the nature of the cannabis experience. So I think if somebody uses cannabis in a culture that supports it, that approves of it, their experience will be better by virtue of that fact.
Right.
So there's a certain shame that a lot of people feel when using any drug. I, for whatever crazy reason, feel it a little bit with cannabis. It's, just a hair of I should be studying, I should be reading, I should be, more focused. This is a little hedonistic. It's a little comfort oriented. I should be working harder. But that's, I think, just the vestiges of this propaganda that I've been fed or something like that. Or maybe it's true, but I understand from one perspective why the cannabis culture drums the benefits of cannabis so hard, that it cures all disease, that it's good for you, that it cures cancer, all this stuff. Because if you have that in your mind, at the very least, it's going to reduce that sort of internal shame that you might feel and makes the entire experience healthier and more beneficial. Because we do construct these limitations. We construct these experiences to some extent. So if you decide that cannabis is a dissociative drug that's hedonistic and comfort-oriented and will take you away from your responsibilities, then that's what it will become. But if you decide, like Terence McKenna did, that it's an intellectual catalyst, that it will facilitate your ability to read and learn and think and write, then it will become that as well.
Yeah, it's a weird one, right? Because people that take it that are prone to paranoia or that are dealing with like some difficult issues in their life right now that they're perhaps trying to avoid, it becomes an uncomfortable experience. Whereas people that are happy and having a good time and in a good place, the marijuana will sort of enhance that. It'll give you this loving, warm feeling of comfort and of like sort of acceptance of your existence, and it's going to be okay.
Right. But I think even the paranoia is like a sort of meme, you could say, a sort of vestige of this propaganda that makes people afraid in the same vein as the bad trip. I think the concept of a bad trip is a very damaging concept because, and I know from personal experience, I never really used psychedelics in high school with the exception of salvia because I was terrified of a bad trip. I'd talk to friends who'd describe bad trips and they'd say, oh, it's a bad trip. It's really bad, it's scary. And I would think, oh, that's terrible. I would never want a bad trip. I'm never going to touch these things because a bad trip would be too much for me to tolerate. And then I started using psychedelics and I realized there's no such thing as a bad trip any more than there's a bad meal or a bad relationship or a bad day. I mean, having an occasional bad thing in life doesn't stop you from doing things like eating or having relationships or living typically. So
what do you mean by are you saying there's no such thing as a bad trip?
Yes.
You're saying there's no such thing as a bad meal?
I'm saying that there is such thing as a bad meal, but it wouldn't prevent you from tripping. And I think that even the bad, or wouldn't prevent you from eating rather, sorry about that. But I think even these bad trips, although they can be difficult, are beneficial and are a learning experience in the same way that a bad meal could be. You learn not to go to that restaurant, or maybe you learn something about what makes you sick or what to be careful of in the future. If you are approaching life from a non-fearful perspective where your intention is to learn, then you can extract benefit from almost any experience. And these difficult psychedelic experiences, I genuinely believe, and this is what is maybe the hardest thing to communicate about psychedelics, is that it's the difficult ones that are often the best. Those are the ones that really teach you something. And when you're trying to talk about psychedelics with people who've never used them, it's not a great selling point to say, oh, the best thing that can happen is you're going to think you're going to die. But that is arguably the best thing that can happen, is to think that you're going to die, because that's a confrontation with the overarching fear, the fear that generates all other fears. And if you conquer that fear, then your life will almost certainly improve.
Well, what is one thing that's sort of genuinely universally accepted as a beneficial experience is a near-death experience. It's sort of universally accepted as a transformative moment in people's lives. Like, I had this near-death experience and I realized, wow, I got to get my shit together. After that heart attack, I realized that life is a gift, and I changed the way I think about things, and I started calling people that I loved and telling them that I loved them. This is the same. You can get a near-death experience from cannabis. You just don't ever die. But you really do. I mean, it's the death of so many perceptions and so many things about your life, especially from edible cannabis, which I think is probably one of the least understood and most potent things that people are consuming on a daily basis. I can't tell you how many times I've given someone edible marijuana and they're fucking convinced that it's been laced with something awful and that they're going to die. But then afterwards, they come out of it and they're like, wow, I guess I got some work to do. The only way I would disagree with you is people that are prone to psychotic breaks.
Yes.
Because there's an absolute genuine connection between people who have a slippery hold on reality and some experiences with psychedelics that lead them down a bad road.
That's true. It's a stressor, and like all stressors, it can precipitate a psychotic break. They've done pretty large-scale epidemiological analyses of psychedelic drug users versus the non-psychedelic drug-using population, and the incidence of mental illness isn't any higher. So I don't think that you can argue that psychedelics cause mental illness, but you can, and in some measures, it seems to actually reduce it in terms of things like alcoholism, substance abuse disorders. But it can be a stressor that would precipitate such an episode in a susceptible individual. And I had a very traumatic and formative experience myself where my best friend had a psychotic break while I was with him tripping. So I've seen this firsthand. I know exactly what it looks like.
Yeah, I've had friends have real bad experiences too, where they're screaming and yelling and then disassociative, and then afterwards become very strange and have a really hard time with reality for a bit.
Yeah.
I've never seen someone have a complete psychotic break.
This was that. He never recovered.
Never.
He never recovered. He was my best friend at the time, and he never recovered.
So he was fine before the psychedelics?
Yes.
Jesus Christ.
But again, and that happened early.
And so now he's still fucked?
Yes.
Damn.
But again, I typically don't tell that story in public because it could be misinterpreted as a scare story. It's impossible to prove the counterfactual. Would it have happened without psychedelics? Almost certainly. I can't say. All I know is that he took a very high dose of a psilocin ester and had this episode. He was hospitalized and he was not the same afterwards. So I'm aware that this is something that happens, but it also typically happens in the early 20s, late teens, the same time that people typically have psychotic breaks and develop schizophrenia.
Yeah, the instances of schizophrenia in people who use cannabis are, cannabis in particular, but I don't know about other psychedelics, but I would imagine they're very similar. They're exactly the same as the incidences of schizophrenia in non-using populations. It's like 1%. 1% across the board seem to have issues with schizophrenia. And the real question is, how many of those people could, is it avoidable? Like, if your friend had never done that and instead had, become a marathon runner or something and, found some other outlets for his energy, would he have never gone down that road? We don't know.
It's impossible to say.
Yeah, it's impossible to say. I think it's very important to talk about that, though. And with further research, perhaps we could isolate genes, like they have for CTE. Now they can do an analysis of your genes and then determine whether or not something like football would be a dangerous path for you because you have a higher probability